Good evening. I'm your host, and welcome to Kenya News Update today. Tonight, we're taking a deep dive into a global movement that has seen hundreds of thousands of people take to the streets in major cities worldwide, all united by a single, powerful demand: regime change in Iran. This is not just a story about protests. It's a story about the power of international solidarity, the complex web of global politics, and the human cost of a brutal crackdown. Over the next 12 minutes, we'll explore the scale of these demonstrations, the geopolitical chessboard they're playing on, and what this means for the future of Iran and its relations with the world. Our journey begins in the heart of Europe, where a massive rally set the tone for a global day of action. Imagine the chill of a Bavarian autumn settling over Munich's historic streets. On a recent Saturday, this city, more accustomed to hosting the elite Munich Security Conference, became the epicenter of a different kind of security discussion. Over 250,000 people, a sea of humanity, gathered not just to protest, but to reclaim a sense of belonging and hope against the shadow of oppression in Iran. The rally, organized as part of a global day of action, was staggering in its scale and symbolism. It was a spectacle of democracy unfolding in the shadow of a conference, often dedicated to statecraft and military alliances. The organizers, a coalition of Iranian diaspora groups and international human rights organizations, had planned for a large turnout, but the final numbers exceeded all expectations. Police estimates, later confirmed by city officials, placed the crowd at 250,000. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of Nakuru. They filled the their Sienwis, the vast grounds famous for Oktoberfest, but this time, the chants were not for beer, but for freedom. The visual was powerful, a mosaic of Iranian flags, photos of those killed in the crackdown, and signs reading "Woman, Life, Freedom" in a dozen languages. The Munich protest was just the beginning. On that same global day of action, coordinated rallies erupted in over 150 cities across 6 continents. From Sydney to Sao Paulo, London to Los Angeles, the message was amplified. In Paris, an estimated 80,000 people marched from the Place de la République to the Iranian embassy. In Toronto, despite freezing rain, a crowd of 60,000 gathered at Queen's Park. In Washington, D.C., a demonstration of 45,000 people stretched from the White House to the Capitol, featuring speeches from bipartisan U.S. lawmakers. The scale was unprecedented for an Iran-focused protest movement. Let's look at the numbers from that single day. In total, organizers estimate that more than 1.2 million people participated worldwide. The top 5 rallies by attendance were Munich with 250,000, Paris with 80,000, Toronto with 60,000, London with 55,000, and Washington, D.C. with 45,000. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a meticulously coordinated international campaign, leveraging social media and diaspora networks with military precision. But what is fueling this massive, global outcry? The immediate catalyst is a bloody crackdown by Iranian authorities that has escalated over the past year. According to reports from human rights groups like Amnesty International and Iran Human Rights, based in Norway, security forces have killed at least 550 protesters since the latest wave of unrest began following the death in custody of Mahsa Amini in September 2022. Furthermore, they report that over 22,000 people have been arrested, and at least 7 protesters have been executed after what the UN calls sham trials. The regime's response has been characterized by internet blackouts, the use of live ammunition against crowds, and systematic torture in detention centers. This brutality, broadcast to the world via smuggled mobile phone footage and satellite internet, has galvanized international opinion in a way previous cycles of protest have not. The protest movement itself, however, has evolved. The initial Woman, Life, Freedom uprising was largely domestic, led by brave Iranians inside the country. The current global wave represents a strategic shift. It is an attempt by the diaspora and international allies to externalize the pressure, to create a ring of global condemnation so loud that the regime in Tehran cannot ignore it. The protesters are demanding not just reforms, but a complete overthrow of the Islamic Republic. Chants of "Marg Bar Dictator" or "Death to the Dictator," aimed at Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, have become the unifying slogan from Munich to Melbourne. This brings us to the complex geopolitical backdrop. The world is watching, and global powers are positioning themselves. The administration of U.S. President Donald Trump, now in its second year since his inauguration in January 2025, has taken a notably harder line. Just last week, the U.S. State Department announced a new package of sanctions targeting Iran's drone manufacturing capabilities and key officials in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, a senior administration official, speaking on background, told reporters that the voice of the Iranian people is clear, and America stands with them. This rhetoric marks a continuation, and perhaps an intensification, of the maximum pressure campaign from Trump's first term. However, the global reaction is not monolithic. China and Russia have blocked stronger action at the United Nations Security Council. China, in particular, is walking a delicate line. While publicly calling for non-interference in Iran's internal affairs, it is also engaged in significant economic diplomacy. Our second source points to a fascinating development. Following the U.S. decision to extend the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or a GOA, for key African partners, China has reportedly agreed to a zero-tariff deal with Kenya on several agricultural products. This is part of a broader pattern where global powers use economic tools to secure alliances. For Iran, China remains a crucial economic lifeline, buying the majority of its oil exports despite U.S. sanctions. This economic shield provided by Beijing fundamentally alters the calculus of international pressure. So, what is the actual impact of these global protests? Can street demonstrations in foreign capitals truly threaten a regime that has survived decades of isolation? This is where the debate intensifies. Proponents of the protest movement argue that their power is multifaceted. First, they shatter the regime's narrative of representing a unified Islamic nation. Images of massive crowds in Western capitals are used by opposition media inside Iran, via VPNs and satellite TV, to show Iranians that they are not alone. Second, they apply direct political pressure on host governments. The 45,000-strong rally in Washington, D.C., was followed by a congressional hearing where lawmakers grilled administration officials on their Iran policy. Third, they sustain morale. For a diaspora often feeling helpless, taking tangible action provides a psychological counterweight to the despair emanating from home. However, skeptics and regional analysts offer a more cautious, some would say cynical, view. They point to history. The Iranian regime has survived mass protests before, most notably in 2009 and 2019, through a combination of brutal repression and waiting for the world's attention to wane. These analysts argue that without a coherent, unified, and armed opposition movement with safe bases outside Iran, a scenario that currently does not exist, street protests abroad are largely symbolic. They change the atmosphere but not the facts on the ground. Furthermore, they warn that overt Western support, particularly from the Trump administration, can be counterproductive, allowing the regime to paint the protesters as puppets of foreign powers, a narrative that still resonates with certain segments of the Iranian population and regional allies. The economic dimension is critical here. Despite the sanctions and protests, Iran's economy, while battered, is not in freefall. Thanks to oil sales to China and a thriving shadow economy, the regime has access to enough hard currency to keep its security apparatus funded and loyal. The IRGC controls vast swathes of the economy, from construction to telecommunications, creating a powerful constituency with a vested interest in the status quo. So, are the protests a genuine threat or merely cathartic theater? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. They represent a sustained, organized challenge to the regime's international legitimacy that it cannot easily dismiss. They keep the issue on the front pages and in diplomatic cables. But to translate that into actual political change requires factors beyond the control of protesters in Munich or Toronto. It requires fractures within the regime's power structure, a severe economic shock that breaks the loyalty of the security forces, or a sustained, nationwide uprising inside Iran that the diaspora movement can support but not lead. Looking ahead, the movement shows no signs of slowing. Organizers have announced another global day of action for next month, with a focus on lobbying parliaments and pushing for the IRGC to be formally designated as a terrorist organization by more countries. They are also leveraging cultural power, with concerts, art exhibitions, and social media campaigns keeping the story alive. The regime, for its part, has responded by accusing foreign governments of fomenting sedition and has launched its own diplomatic offensive, sending envoys to friendly capitals in Africa and Latin America to shore up support. In Kenya, the government of President William Ruto has maintained a cautious, neutral stance, emphasizing the principle of non-interference while expressing general concern for human rights, a balancing act familiar to many nations with complex ties to both the West and the East. As we conclude this deep dive, The picture that emerges is of a world grappling with how to respond to a profound human rights crisis. The 250,000 people in Munich, and the over 1 million others worldwide, have made their stance clear. They have built a global megaphone for a cause they believe is just. But in the high-stakes game of international relations, where energy security, great power competition, and regional stability are constant considerations, moral clarity often collides with pragmatic Realpolitik. The Iranian regime has proven resilient, but it now faces an opposition that is more globally connected, media-savvy, and determined than ever before. The coming months will test whether this global chorus can produce a change in tune from Tehran, or if it will become another haunting echo of unmet aspirations. For now, the world watches and the protests continue. This has been a Kenya News Update Today deep dive. Subscribe to Kenya News Update Today for more in-depth coverage of the stories shaping our world.